The Black Death wasn't just a pandemic. It was a shockwave, a moment when the world broke, reshaped itself, and never went back to the way things were. Most of us hear about it as that medieval disease that killed a lot of people, which is technically true, but also wildly incomplete. The real story is far stranger, far bigger, and far more connected to our world today than you might think. This was a plague that traveled across continents before passports existed, rewrote economies without anyone voting on it, shattered belief systems in a matter of months, and somehow accidentally helped launch the Renaissance. It killed millions, terrified everyone, and yet pushed humanity into a new era. So today, we're going to break down what the Black Death actually was, how it spread so fast, why it was so deadly, and how it transformed society in ways no one could have predicted. Because once you understand this moment in history, you'll realize it wasn't just a tragedy. It was a turning point. Let's dive into the plague that changed everything. Imagine a disease so deadly that people could go to bed healthy and never wake up. A disease that spread so fast, it outran armies, burned through cities, collapsed entire kingdoms, and erased villages so completely that nobody remembered their names. A disease that killed up to half of Europe, and yet strangely also pushed humanity into one of its greatest periods of change. This is the story of the Black Death. And it's not just a story about rats or bad hygiene or medieval chaos. It's a story about globalization science, fear economics, and the surprising ways a disaster can reshape the world. Let's go back to the beginning, to a moment long before Europe ever knew what was coming. The Black Death didn't start in Europe. It didn't even start on a ship. Its origins are traced back to Central Asia in the grasslands and trade routes where humans and animals interacted constantly. Here lived a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis, minding its own business inside fleas, who fed on rodents who lived near humans who traveled across continents. And thanks to growing trade across Asia, especially through the Silk Road, this microscopic hitchhiker eventually found its way into the bloodstream of millions. Now, if you grew up hearing that the plague spread because people in the Middle Ages were dirty, that's not quite right. Even in modern times, fleas and rodents carry plague bacteria in many parts of the world. Hygiene helps, sure, but the real problem was how interconnected the world had become. Trade networks were booming. Caravans carried silk spices and death. Ships carried grain goods and rats. The medieval world was globalizing fast, but medicine and science were not keeping up. One key moment in the story takes place at the Black Sea port of Kaffa. Legend says that when a plague outbreak hit the besieging Mongol army, they began catapulting infected corpses over the walls. Was this early biological warfare, or just a desperate rumor hard to say? But what we do know is that fleeing merchants sailed away from Kaffa, carrying the disease with them across the Mediterranean like a deadly souvenir. Everywhere those ships docked, the plague exploded. Let's talk about what the Black Death actually was. Because there wasn't just one version of it, there were three. The first was the bubonic plague. This is the one most people know. It caused swollen lymph nodes, or buboes that turned black and painful. People got fever chills and exhaustion. Mortality rates were extremely high, but some people survived. The second was the pneumonic plague. This one infected the lungs. It spread through cough droplets, not fleas. And it killed almost everyone who got it. This was the real nightmare version, fast, invisible, and unstoppable. The third was the septicemic plague. This one infected the bloodstream, directly causing internal bleeding. Death could occur in a matter of hours. People would collapse suddenly sometimes, without any visible symptoms. Together, these three forms created a perfect storm of chaos. So, how fast did it spread? Let's put it like this. Imagine a disease so contagious and lethal that it makes modern pandemics look like minor inconveniences. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death swept through Europe in waves moving sometimes faster than news could travel. Entire families were wiped out. Entire towns were abandoned. Fields became empty. Churches were overwhelmed. People couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. And because nobody knew what caused the disease, explanations ranged from the poetic to the bizarre. Some believed the air was poisoned. Others blamed earthquakes, stars, planets, weather patterns, foreigners, minorities, or sins. Many believed it was divine punishment. Medieval medicine relied heavily on ancient theories of humors, ideas about balancing bodily fluids, and none of that helped with plague. Desperate for protection, some people turned to superstition. They carried flowers or herbs in their pockets. They burned incense. They fled cities. They locked themselves indoors. Entire groups like the flagellants whipped themselves in public, believing pain and repentance could stop God's wrath. It didn't. One of the most iconic images from this era is the plague doctor, the person wearing a long robe, a pointed hat, glass-eyed mask, and a beaked nose stuffed with herbs. And despite how creepy the outfit looks today, the idea behind it was surprisingly scientific. Doctors believed that herbs could purify bad air, and the full body outfit was meant to block infection. In an era without germ theory, this was one of the earliest attempts at personal protective equipment. Now let's talk about numbers, not because we want to, but because understanding the scale of the Black Death is essential. Historians estimate that somewhere between 75 and 200 million people died worldwide. Europe lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its population. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London saw catastrophic losses. Farms, workshops, and entire villages simply disappeared. It was a medieval version of the Thanos snap, except instead of disappearing instantly, people suffered through a slow, terrifying collapse of society. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The Black Death didn't just destroy. It reshaped everything. It fundamentally changed how Europe worked. Because so many people died, there was suddenly a massive labor shortage. Fields still needed farming. Buildings still needed building. Goods still needed producing. Workers now scarce gained bargaining power. Wages rose. Serfs who were previously bound to their lords walked away from estates that could no longer control them. Feudalism, the backbone of medieval Europe, began to crumble. It sounds strange, even uncomfortable, but the plague ended up accelerating economic freedom for millions. For the first time, common people could choose where to live and work. They could demand better pay. They could bargain. The economy started shifting toward a more modern, more flexible system. Religion also went through a crisis. The church, which had enormous authority, couldn't stop the plague. Priests died in huge numbers. People lost faith in old institutions. Many began asking new questions about science, medicine, and the natural world. This intellectual curiosity helped spark the Renaissance, the cultural rebirth that gave us advancements in art, science, philosophy, and technology. Governments changed too. Cities began developing public health systems, tracking illness, regulating cleanliness, and most importantly, inventing quarantine. The idea of isolating ships for 40 days was pioneered in Venice. The word quarantine literally comes from the Italian word quaranta, meaning 40. This was the world's first organized system of disease control, and it became a foundation of modern public health. And architecture that changed as well. Cities redesigned streets for better airflow and sanitation. Hospitals, previously just shelters for the dying, evolved into institutions focused on treatment. The Black Death didn't just shape society, it shaped the physical world as well. Now, here's the part that surprises most people: the plague never truly went away. Yersinia pestis still exists today in wild animals and flea populations. Modern cases still occur even in places like the United States. But thanks to antibiotics and modern medicine, the disease is treatable. What was once the most terrifying killer in human history is now just another bacteria that we can control. So, what's the real legacy of the Black Death? It changed everything: labor, religion, science, medicine, government, and culture. It broke the world and built a new one in its place. Without the plague, Europe might never have had the Renaissance, the rise of modern economies, or the scientific revolution. The Black Death was not just a tragedy, it was a turning point. And it leaves us with one haunting question. If a single disease could reshape the world so dramatically in the 1300s, What could a future pandemic change next? So that's the Black Death, not just a medieval horror story, but one of the most transformative events in human history. It wiped out entire communities, toppled old systems, and forced Europe to rebuild itself in ways that shaped the modern world. The way we work, the way we govern, the way we think about science and disease, all of it carries the fingerprints of this pandemic. The plague didn't just kill people. It changed economies. It weakened feudalism. It shook religion. It pushed cities to rethink public health. And in its wake came innovation curiosity, and eventually the Renaissance. It was devastating, but also a strange catalyst for progress. And it leaves us with a haunting reminder. Outbreaks don't just affect health, they affect everything. Society doesn't respond to pandemics. It transforms because of them. If you enjoyed this breakdown and want to explore more turning points that shaped our world, stick around. There's a lot more history waiting to be explained.